How's everybody? So I'm not starting. I just talk. So I always think I have more time to do my talks than I do. So I'm kind of known for finishing slides before I get up. I did finish a slide at that table, and not actually rehearsing them. So that might come out. Also, I had this wonderful outline, and some of the slides are pretty much what was in the outline, and I didn't get around to getting the nice animated GIF in there for that slide, but I do have some good ones on other slides. So it should go, I think, fairly well. I don't got any other stories. I don't know. I have plenty of stories, but not. You have
5 minutes till it's supposed to start. So
Okay. Well, does anybody know what I'm talking about? That's going to be interesting. Okay. All right. Who here is not an Android developer? Okay. Who here kind of does iOS as well? Who here is like primarily an iOS developer? I imagine your reaction is going to be interesting. I imagine everyone's reaction is going to be a little interesting. My slides and my shorts and t-shirts and general lack of preparedness aside, I promise you we're professional, and it's a wonderfully functional framework and everything's cool. I'm sure I'll convince you all of that. Does anybody know what that logo came from? Okay. It's an HOV lane. Nobody ever gets it. Ugh. All right. Never mind. All right, I think I get started a little early because it's mostly just me talking about myself for the first couple of slides, and then we move on from there. So, okay. This is Doppl. It's Android-centric code sharing. Still working on the branding a bit. We'll see what that 4-word phrase turns down to. I am Kevin Galligan. I'm a president of a company called TouchLab. I've been doing Android since before the G1. They had like a contest. Google had one to see people make apps and stuff, yada yada. Java since '96 and programming since a really long time. TouchLab is a mostly Android consulting company. We were only Android for years, since like 2010 up until the last year or two. Heavily involved in the community. We do the New York Android meetup, which is now over 4,000 people. We do Droidcon Nyc, a little bit of Droidcon SF, kind of, sort of ish. So that's what we do. So I'll get right into it. Doppl, this is one of the slides that looks like the outline. Android-centric code sharing, and it's built on top of J2 OBJC. J2 OBJC converts Java to Objective-C. It's made by Google. The person at Google that started it actually worked directly for James Gosling. If you look at his LinkedIn page, James Gosling gave him a recommendation, so I assume you know who that is. If not, don't worry about it. They use it in major projects, so if you have Sheets or Inbox or a few other projects like that on iOS, it is directly using this tool. They told the story about how they built this really complex spreadsheet library in Java, and that was part of the reason why they were making J2 OBJC, is just the imagining doing that in iOS and in JavaScript. So they actually use J2 OBJC and GWT to share this logic. There's lots of JRE. There's like a tiny bit of Android, like log and a couple other things. It is very stable. They're at version 2.02. It is very difficult to use. So unless you are an Android developer who also understands makefiles and likes to use makefiles in Xcode, you probably will not get started. It took like a day or two to get something functional, which is not really a good onboarding experience. And it's just logic, and they explicitly do just logic. So there's no database stuff. There's a little bit of networking, but really it's just, you're going to share your logic, which is great. But Doppl, which is the thing I've been working on and we've been working on as a company for a year and a half. We had a Gradle build tool, Android extensions, so that includes SQLite, shared preferences, threading, and a bunch of other stuff, which we take directly from Android open source framework and adapt them to work in an iOS context. If you can imagine taking the Android context and slicing it in half, and taking out the pieces that you would commonly find in an app or in a library, essentially what we're doing, and removing things that don't make sense, like content provider doesn't make sense in an iOS context. So we have a common library format that gets defined, and some libraries, so RxJava, the new Android architecture components, retrofit, SQL, Delight, Event Bus, yada, 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 a whole bunch over the last year or so. These all work with verified and tested versions in an iOS context. And then we also have testing support. So you can do essentially UI-less integration testing as well as unit testing in Android and on the iOS side to ensure that everything you convert is working fine. And by the way, I think I missed a slide about this. This is not about UI. This is all about logic. So think everything below the UI level. And that's essentially what we're trying to do, is extend J2EJC to not just do logic, but to do threading and database storage and networking and all the stuff you do underneath. So conceptually, visually, this is J2EJC. You get the JRE, you got a little bit of Android, you got JUnit, Mojito, a few other things. And then what we're doing is adding all this other stuff. So Android context, library format, Gradle plugin, testing support. We're going to have some help with the Xcode side, because that's really something that is foreign to the Android folks and is like a very long series of steps just to like get it to run, which I'm used to because I've been doing it for a year, but explaining it to people is rough. And then we got, here's like a sampling of the libraries, right? So retrofit, JSON, RoomDB, RxJava, Dagger, architecture, Android, SQL Delight, yada yada. But I want to be clear, like this isn't drawn to scale. The amount of effort and engineering that went into these various things, the J2EJC code base is super stable and like works really, really well. And it is an amazing amount of like, we would never have been able to build this. And the other thing too is people are like, well, you're just a small company. I don't feel comfortable using your thing. And I'm like, yeah, but the real computer science-y engineering part of this is all from Google, and they've been working on it for years. So we're just kind of adding stuff on top of it. And you have to sort of keep that in mind. Anyway, okay, but why? Right? And I get that question a lot. And the obvious answer, DRY. Code duplication is time-consuming, and it's error-prone. And if you're like this monk here where you have just a thing you're duplicating, that's fine. But in every context we've ever been in, the iOS app is a moving target. So you got to keep up with that. And you imagine running an Android-only shop from like 2010 until basically now. Most of your work is like, hey, here's our iOS app, make it work. And by the way, we don't want to pay your designer. And then we have to have that argument with them, right? So there's also a part of it, though, for me personally, it feels wrong. Like I've had enough of copying code, and I want something that's going to let us not copy code. And there are things, but none of the things that were out there we really liked. My analogy is I'm in a band, and I'm in an original band, and nobody cares, nobody comes to see it, but it's a lot more satisfying than playing in a cover band. So that's why we do it. And good developers, as a manager and as a developer, and someone has to recruit people, if all you're doing all day is like this, the really good people don't want to stick around. So you got to get out of that rut. It's not good stuff. Android and iOS, and I knew this before, but having gone through this process of doing, they're very similar platforms that present themselves as very different, but ultimately they're sugar water in a can, right? Main and background threads, SQLite, local files, networking, location, all kinds of other stuff. I'd say that they're same methods, different names, which is essentially what you'll find when you go under the hood. Again, sticking below the UI level, there's usually a little bit of whatever, but even there, it's actually surprising. So I want you to imagine like a mobile VM. We're going to build this thing that exists, and it's a third thing, and it's got an MVVM reactive architecture, local DB, files, threading, and networking, easy interop with native components, So you're not in this all or one scenario, which most of these frameworks give you. Like you're either stuck with everything theirs, or you can, or whatever. You should be able to call out to the native stuff. Large community and library selection, optimized and support IDE experience. And it compiles down or runs on Android, iOS, and you can use Android Studio and Xcode to do your UIs and call into shared code. Like this imaginary thing that we could go build, right? And it would look something like this. And I could see this being ideal, and this would be great, right? And people will argue, well, that's what React Native is. I'm like, yeah, kind of, not really. That sounds like a good idea. Well, what we're trying to build essentially is the same thing, except you're just yanking one platform out, right? So the code is all Android with all Android libraries, and it's all on Android Studio. And the app on the Android side is 100% native, which also means, by the way, there's no cross-platform stuff on the Android side. It's all just shared code that goes over to iOS. So it looks more like this, right? Which the contrast was much better on my screen. You can't see on the other side, but essentially it's just the same stuff, right? And then you can call out very easily into native stuff or in the view controllers or whatever, right? And that's kind of where the whole name Doppl came from. You've got retrofit and other libraries that are the same, and they're functional, and they look very similar, but they're not 100% the same, right? So I don't know. I thought that was a hilarious article. Anyway, threw some thing in. OK, so one of the things that's different is a shared native interface. So if you're using Xamarin, or you're using React Native, or you're using NativeScript, you can set up call-outs to the native stuff that's outside of what you normally do, but it's not necessarily in your everyday natural flow. And it can be very difficult to do that, or at least it's not something that's intuitive. In this environment, you essentially set up a Java interface, and then when you start up your app or you're doing something, you just pass in an implementation of that interface on either side. And if you're on the Android side, that can be Kotlin, and if you're on the iOS side, that can be Swift. So it also gives the opportunity to not share everything. You can choose at what point you're going to stop the sharing and do all native code. So as a concrete example, the top is an interface for one of our view models. And essentially what this is doing, you pass this in and it calls out from the shared code to do things in the UI. And on Kotlin, you just implement the thing and do whatever the heck you're going to do in Kotlin. Toast for report error, which we should probably do something a little more robust. But it's our junior team working on the Droidcon app. So anyway, I'm not going to comment. I still have to do a review of the code they've submitted. But and then on the Swift side, it's basically the same thing. Data refresh, report error, update RSVP. These are the things. And you just essentially, when you start up the view controller on Swift, you just say, here's this thing, and you pass it in. And it calls out and does that stuff. Let's see, blah, 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 blah. OK, I was talking about that. All right. Yeah, so what we're banking on, right, is that rather than creating this other cross-platform-y thing, Google is spending a lot of serious time and money on Studio and Gradle and their internal libraries. Lots of great community libraries, obviously. If you really sit back and think about it, for the size and the age of the community, Android's probably the most robust that I've seen. Like, people are super engaged. We're here. Everyone does all these things. And there's just tons of great stuff out there. And we could take advantage of it. Like, for example, the Room DB, when it came out, I couldn't go to I/O this year. I was stuck home for a long reason. And they launched RoomDB on Wednesday. And then Thursday morning, I found the source, which was in the source jar, thankfully. And then I had it working in about 90 minutes, like on iOS, right? Like, a lot of these things are very easy to leverage. And we essentially get the benefit of Google in a death match with Apple trying to have the best development environment, right? I've talked to the developer tools team, and they asked, like, hey, how can we help this come along? I'm like, well, just make Android Studio better continuously, and we'll just take advantage of that. Performance. So if you know anything about me, New York crowds tend to, I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of a database nerd. I actually did the thing ORM Lite, the port, in like 2009, 2010. So either you're welcome or I'm sorry, depending how you look at that. And since then, whatever. Here's a benchmark. On the left is an Android phone, and on the right was an iPhone. I don't know why we took a picture, but we did. But the iPhone was beating the Android phone on the database benchmarks in every type of database that we tried. And then we swapped it out with, like, I think an S7. And the S7 beat it on Cupboard because Cupboard is reflection-based. So reflection in the new Android versions is pretty good. Reflection in JTOBJC is, like, you know, okay. But performance was kind of surprising and amazing. So, all right, great. Business case, which I got to give the business case, because if I just sit up here and do code, I think you're going to remember none of it. But I'll go through as quick as possible. So one of the assumptions that we make is native tools are the best tool to build for either platform, right? So a thought exercise, if you were going to build a tablet app that you're going to stick to a wall, and it's never going to run anything but iOS, you would be crazy to build that in React Native, or God forbid HTML5. Because to get from 0 to done is going to take you an extra amount of time. And like this horrible chart that has no context is like the hashed part is like the extra amount of time. I have a friend who's heavily involved in the Xamarin community and super Xamarin, you know, meetup person, and he's all about it. And I just asked him, like, if you were going to make an Android app in Android Studio versus Xamarin, how much more time would it take? And he said, you know, they kept promising it would get better, but it's like 30 up to 50% longer for the same amount of features. And there's a number of reasons for that. And then your hope is you're going to make that up at the end, right? But I'll get into why that's not really a good hope. Obviously, the statement is a little bit controversial. If you're a React fan or a Xamarin fan or whatever fan, you're not going to agree that it takes you longer to build the same amount of functionality. But I would counter, number one, library support maturity. And then somebody would be like, well, JavaScript's got a lot of libraries. I'm like, yeah, but JavaScript doesn't have a lot of history of doing native mobile development at the level that like Android and iOS would. The library maturity is not quite there. The IDEs and tools, I mean, Android Studio, they're trying to make it like the tool to build mobile apps. So you have more stuff, right? You're gonna run into weird build and runtime issues more often with newer libraries, especially if they're emulated libraries on top of other things. You're gonna have missing features. So we talked to someone who was building a fitness app, and they were all going to start doing React Native, and they ran into an issue of like, well, it doesn't have this, this, or this, and then we have to implement that or wait for it. And it was kind of like, yeah, I know. And that's one of the things I think that's really useful about anything that can let you do very easy interop to call out to the native parts of the platform. Like we did an app, Doppl doesn't have any location stuff, but we need location, and we just made an interface that did, because basically Android and iOS, same platform, different names. And that worked really well. And the WTFs, which I think if you've been developing long enough, you know what these are, where it just stops working and you don't know why. And it's going to happen on any platform you're on. And there's like a progression, right, that starts with, okay, I'll do a clean build. Okay, that didn't work. All right, I'll do a new checkout. Oh, that didn't work. A couple days later, I guess I have to install the IDE again, and that doesn't work. And then eventually you're going to wipe your OS or get a new laptop. That one is probably once a career. But those things happen, and they're going to happen more often in these weird things. Like I tried to do Xamarin and Xamarin Studio for a while, and you just ran into these days where it was like, this just ain't compiling. And I'm sure you get more experience, but there's a lot smaller community that's going to help you. So anyway, these things all kind of add up to take a longer time to build stuff. Plus, you still need to do the other UI, which is not really true in like native script, I guess. It's kind of true in React. It's 100% true in Xamarin, unless you're doing Xamarin Forms. But I would also contend, since you're in this room, you might agree that trying to get one good usable UI from a cross-shared UI system is going to take a lot more time than just kind of putting together two UIs for a consumer app, not simple apps. Anyway, yada, 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 the assumption that native is best is something you're going to have to agree with, or you're not going to buy the rest of what I'm saying, but okay. Which platform takes longer to build for? And I would ask, but I won't bother, you know, I won't wait for answers. It's, everyone kind of says Android, iOS, or whatever, but it's a trick question, right? It's the first one. Even if you have perfect specs, you're gonna have to build this thing and test and modify your architectural concepts. And you're gonna wind up finding out that what you thought was a good idea was not a good idea. And you're gonna find out that the back-end team gave you an API that doesn't make any sense in a mobile context. Or you need another piece of information that wasn't there. And all this cycles, you have to go back and forth and do these things, and you're going to be not keeping 100% of your code, and things are going to take longer, right? The second platform gets to take advantage of these lessons, and that's one of the reasons why running an Android consulting shop you get the benefit of they already have a price in mind because the iOS shop charged them something, and we get the benefit of all that extra time they had to spend figuring out the problems. But in the real world, there are no perfect specs, right? So Agile exists to iterate. That's why Agile came around, because everyone had to finally accept the fact that the business person doesn't really know what they want until they see it. Lots of code gets thrown away, and it's waste, but it's valuable waste because you get to the end and you learn these lessons, and these are important. Well, the problem with using some environment that adds this tax, this slower progress of developing, is you're also putting that on the entire process of learning these lessons. So it's like this bad multiplicative, like long chain of things where I think people do a simple analysis on how they're going to save time, and they look back and say, oh, we have 8 screens in this app. That probably should take X time. If we had just done it with this other thing, then we would save all that time. But I'm like, yeah, but you spent twice as much time just on the other screens you threw away, and everything had changed. So that's kind of where people are wrong about their calculation of cross-platform and code sharing. Like, you could easily make an argument in, especially a startup environment where you're going to be really iterating a lot, that just building 2 apps is going to be better almost always than doing a cross-platform thing. And like what we're trying to do is just make that better still, right? Another argument is risk, right? So in this framework, the Android side is 100% native. And I think we would all be disingenuous to have a serious argument that Android historically and still now is not the more risky platform to deliver an application for. There are many versions. There are many devices. I don't know, the file system sometimes is a little easier to crack into, yada, yada, right? So to always deliver 100% native is going to be your least risky, best case scenario, I think. Sharing code is optional. So if you feel like you only want to share some of your code, you don't have to do, it's not all or nothing. If you're 2 weeks out from release and there's some problem in your share code, you just cut it out, you code it in directly in Swift, and then after you release, you go figure out what was wrong, right? You don't have this big freak out situation. And if you already have native apps, you don't need to rewrite them or train on a really new skill set other than the Gradle task and whatever. You can just say, okay, we're going to start with this, share that over, and see how that goes. Another thing, I didn't even bring it up this, but like we talked to some clients about it, like if you want to do cross-platform verification tests to verify that Android and iOS do the same thing, then you could write the tests using Doppl and then run them against either platform independently, and then you would sort of have this singular test scenario, which that sounds nice. I'm not entirely sold that's going to work well either, but perfect world, see how it goes. Anyway, and business case again, community. We're here. It's great to have this existing community that you can leverage. So the Android side, again, it's just Android. Like, we don't have to now build a native script conference or whatever. Like, you don't have to do any of that stuff. So it felt like the sort of easiest path to having a whole new framework. This next slide is kind of weird. I need to explain it in sort of detail. But this is a thing that we've had. We've met with some clients recently, and also that same friend who was the Xamarin friend, I started explaining what we're building. And I would say he's kind of like negative on everything. He's like one of those developers that got old and got tired of the promises. So all he was doing was like pointing out the issues. And one of his big issues was, yeah, you can share the logic, but all your time you're really spending in the UI. The UIs take so much time. And I was like, yeah, that's true. Except if I'm going to spend 2 days ripping the wires out of the low-level shared code and all the architecture and the offline and what do you do with errors, that's potentially needs to be much more precise and careful than if I'm going to spend 2 days getting the corners correct on the cards because the design kicked it back. You know what I mean? And we've been working with this one client who we went in to advise how they should structure their team, and they had, I think, 9 Android engineers now. And they were trying to figure out how to get everyone working on every bit, and I'm like, you should stop. You've got 2 super senior people who are guiding the architecture, and you got someone who got out of a boot camp who's got 3 months of experience, and you want them to edit your architecture? Like, absolutely not. The engineers do not want to be doing the screens. They just want to do a skeletal screen, come back and keep working on the architecture. Let the new people go in and do the screens, and then maybe they'll learn the architecture a bit. But I think a lot of teams are going to drift, rather than iOS and Android teams, to be more like architectural and UI teams. could be wrong, but that was the argument I had. The chart is if you change something on a button on the top, the potential to damage everybody else is way lower than if you change like your absolute shared code that's deep in your architecture, and you want to be careful about that. We want to share that and reduce the errors, and that's the whole idea. I added this slide about an hour ago, so we'll see. Sharing is optional, as I mentioned before, so if you or your security team feels like we don't want to do X, you don't have to do it. You can code it all natively. Sensitive endpoints are handed off to native iOS. So when we do networking, retrofit stops at the here's a blob of stuff layer, and that hands it off to URL session. And that's handling the SSL stuff, and that's handling anything that's going out to the outside world. Also, I was talking to Mark Murphy yesterday, and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot. We made SQL Safer work across platform, which was interesting. I am interested to hear what security issues there are with other frameworks. I talked to people, I did a little Googling, and they're like, yeah, React Native, like SSL, I don't know, but it seemed very vague. So are the security concerns like vague FUD, or is it like they're real things, and what are they? And are we effectively addressing them, or are there still like major concerns that people have with the kind of environment we're setting up? I don't know. How to use, I'm gonna go this really quick because it's a lot of Gradle, and you should just look at the website. Essentially, though, you set up Gradle, decide if you want a separate Java lib or you want to put it inside your Android build. You can do those two options. I'm on the fence, actually. Long story. You add the Gradle plugin. You add the Doppl libraries. Again, they are doppelganger libraries. We have retrofit, and then we have the weird iOS retrofit that is syntactically compatible. And then you add Doppl config, which is essentially tell it where to go, give it a few things, yada yada. One of them actually, I was going to demo it, but we don't have time. Essentially, it makes Objective-C, so when you're running a debugger in Xcode, you can see the Objective-C, which is somewhat readable but kind of verbose, except in cases of a lot of lambdas, which is RxJava, right? So not super readable, but you can tell the compiler to do Java directives. So when you're debugging, it'll be running the Objective-C, but it'll show you the Java that it came from, which is far more readable, yada yada. It's kind of cool. Anyway, the iOS side, you create an Xcode project, and embedded framework, add complex settings, there's arc and linker and headers, and oh, by the way, do this, and it's a bridging header maybe if you're doing Swift, and a whole bunch of other stuff and run. So it's kind of like taxes. We are currently writing some helpful stuff that is essentially going to have two modes. Either I don't want to worry about this too much, so just set up my Xcode project, and it'll set up the default one and kind of manage it, or I know Xcode really well, don't get in my way, and then you just kind of manage the source once it gets over there. I kind of don't like trying to manage the Xcode projects, so these things are complicated, but in testing with users, especially Android users, this part is where they stop. So I want to get that out of the way. Conversely, if you've ever watched an iOS developer try to open an Android project, much less like change it, it's amazing. Like the whole just open the folder, don't look for the project file, takes a couple of minutes to like get through their heads. Anyway, I guess amazing was overselling it, whatever. Okay, moving on. So we have this thing called the Droidcon Nyc Ios, AKA Sad Puppy, quick story. Back in 2016, we did an app for iOS using Doppl, a much older version, but still there. And then we had Apple say no, they would not publish it because they had Android stuff, and they said it is not appropriate for the App Store. So I, in a fit of hilarious rage, made a little joke, and I covered all the Android things with this little dog, and everywhere it said Android in the code, I replaced it with Sad Puppy dynamically, and then they said yes, which I don't know why, and I feel like I'm pissed because I wanted to like do a little better of a joke if they were going to do it. First of all, it's not a puppy, it's a full-grown dog. But it's still sad, or at least it looks sad. Dogs don't have the same emotions that we do visually, but whatever. All right, great. So that's what happened. So anyway, but this app is old, right? I found this commit. First of all, we started doing Kotlin in the Droidcon app in 2014. I was a super early Kotlin nerd. Also, it was funny, the commit right before that was like, we were trying out retrofit. That's how relatively old this was, and this app has kind of gone that far back. So we're using a ton of old stuff, and obviously Android's been moving very fast, because the idea of doing something without retrofit at this point seems like insane. we had a bunch of homegrown stuff and like, some horrible networking library that some dude wrote and yada yada. So now for this year, it's happy birthday to the pug. We're adding Retrofit 2, RX2, architecture components, and room, and refactoring the entire Droidcon app. And so that's what's going on. We're trying to do it sort of publicly. The code's public. I'm going to show you a bit in a second. Status. So we released a technical preview about a month ago. Technical preview is just my way of getting out of the responsibility of you telling me it doesn't work. But we're going to have sort of a real release at Droidcon, although you can totally use it now. Like we're using it commercial clients and whatever. Everything's patchy 2. I know that there was a recent dust up with React and Facebook and the licenses and all that stuff, and I don't know that that's going to be enough of a compelling reason to not to change sides, but at least you don't have to ask questions about why. I was kind of like, whatever. Tutorial on the thing, go check it out. Yeah, but in a few weeks we're going to be rapidly updating everything. We had an issue when we launched, which was we only had Retrofit 1 and RX Java 1, which seems quaint, sort of like antiquated. And the problem we had was Retrofit 2 required OK HTTP. And I actually had conversations with Jesse Wilson. He was like all on board with making this work. But it seemed like, wow, we have to figure out how to do SSL inside of OK HTTP and kind of fake this out and all this stuff. And it's like, wow, that seems really complicated. And then I have to convince security people that I haven't messed up their SSL, and like I'm not going to do that. So, and then it just kind of hit me a few weeks ago. So we're just like swapping out the OKHTTP stuff with like iOS's regular URL session code. And that totally works great and performs great. And you get SSL and you get HTTP2 and you get all that stuff. I will say that at the moment, there is a nice little race condition which I'm debugging. So you can't use this. But literally, this got coded like in the past week. So whatever. But by Droidcon, that'll definitely be released. RX Java 2, it works. One of the issues with J2BJC is that it lives inside of iOS literally as code, which means it's not garbage collected. It is reference counted memory reclamation, which normally works okay. But if you have memory cycles, you have to figure out how to break them up. And RX Java, if there was an award for most self-referencing code, it won. And it's very difficult to do that without I need to lock myself or someone else in a room for a solid week and just sort that out. But that is coming too. There's also a weird edge case race condition. I think that's actually a J2BJC thing. Welcome to the frontier of tech. You're gonna have to fix stuff. Swift help, I already mentioned before. It's compatible with Swift, but it could be a little friendlier. Like right now, there's a bridging header. Actually, I figured out how to get rid of that now in a very easy way. So the Droidcon app doesn't have a bridging header, yada, yada, yada. The maintenance thing is coming, so that'll be good. Quick, got it. Memory cycles, some issues. Memory cycles, as I mentioned, normally this isn't a big problem. If you have objects that all reference each other in a circle, you have to just designate which one is the parent, which one is not, and then it'll be able to clean those up with a weak reference. This is just stuff you got to learn. And iOS developers have dealt with this since the beginning, so whatever. Runtime size, it adds anywhere from 10 to 15 megs to the total package that's going to be downloaded on iOS. But I would say, again, comparatively, React Native adds 5 or 6. But on both platforms, this adds 0 on Android because there's nothing cross-platform about it. And by the way, if you want to do instant apps, there's a 4 meg weight limit. So we don't affect that at all. And debugging, if you got issues that are iOS only in the shared code, which is hopefully relatively rare, it's a little verbose, but it is what it is. All right, great. But Kotlin, iOS is trash. Why am I sitting here? You know what I mean? And I have gotten this thing. We've gone into clients, or potential clients, just to talk about cross-platform stuff. And we met with the Android team and the iOS team, and the Android team is like, we're just doing Kotlin. We don't care about this Java crap. And and obviously recently, it's the last couple months. And same thing on iOS. They're it's fun to do Swift. And I will say, you shouldn't care, right? If you have an organization that's totally cool with just doing 2 apps, you should not care. Kotlin is great, right? I still like Java, but Kotlin's great, and we use both. And if you just roll into your iOS team's sprint planning meeting with this weird new framework and hey, I solved your problems, they're not going to appreciate it too much. They're certainly not going to like to do any sort of Java thing. In my experience talking to any developer about cross-platform stuff that doesn't need it is generally like this. You just keep suggesting things, and it's like, no, no, nope, no. And like not even talking about it, just like, see ya. So this is, I love this GIF. I just like, I'll put it in. Anyway, but you shouldn't care until management, right? That's who's going to give you pressure. And these things are constant. And not every org. Some orgs are going to be totally cool and believe their developers that we should still build this way. But the org that brought us in and the teams that were like, no, we only do Kotlin, no, we only do Swift. And I was like, you're going to be doing JavaScript really soon because the web team's like, hey, React Native does all this stuff. We should do all those things. And they wouldn't like listen to me. And I'm like, you got to give them another answer. Yeah, and like here is another answer, right? It's, we can save this logic. We can do both. We can do logic on both platforms, and we're going to have a better efficiency and all this kind of stuff. But we're not taking the risk of rewriting the app from scratch and that kind of thing, right? So the sales pitch is give them the safe and smart option from Doppl salesperson. I don't know. I made that up. So that's the contact info. I'm going to show you really quick. How many I got? Like 7 minutes? 6? All right, cool. All right. You ever see the cooking shows where you've like prepared a thing? I've kind of prepared a thing, which I'm going to show you. Let me just do. Oh, where did settings go? How's everyone still doing? Confused? All right, let me do. All right, so we've got the Droidcon app. And the Droidcon app has a bunch of screens. Oh, this is going to go great. How do you get presenter mode? Oh, man. Does anybody know? There we go. OK. It didn't help with the fonts at all. But, oh, man. That worked. Fantastic. All right. Well, let me see. User detail. We're actually in a different project. So, glad I got to show you everything. Hold on. Let me give it one more shot. I think I can nail this. My laptop died. I had this super awesome laptop, and then I had to get this thing, which was like a hand-me-down until we go and buy the next thing, and it is an unpleasant thing. So this is the user detail fragment, and we're on user detail view model. So user detail view model does a bunch of stuff that you call into, and it registers a user detail host. This is the interface that is the thing that's going to be cross-platform, right? We define two methods, find user error and on user found. And then over on the Kotlin side, user detail fragment, we implement user detail hosts, and then when things come back, we've got find user error, which shows a toast, which is probably not sufficient, but that's OK. And on user found, which shows a bunch of user data, right? And that's how that works. And you pass this in, you register it with the view model. And then on iOS, I don't even want to figure out how to do this. Well, you can't, you have no hope in seeing that. 1 second. Display. Can you like, oh, it won't let you do. That's garbage. Well, does anybody know how to do fonts? No, nobody does this. If you could imagine, how do you get this to be bigger? Oh, that sucks. Well, squint. There is a thing, I'll describe it, where you register in the view model, and it, wow, come on, there's got to be, you can't see that at all. Well, you'd have to trust me, but it totally works. You can just, in Swift, you register, you essentially extend the as user data host, and then it's upset because user data host isn't defined. See the little red thing that popped up? And then you just have to go through and sort of add these methods, which are find user error, which is what we had in the other thing, and then on user found, which shows the user data. And that's how that works. Yeah, I'm kind of new to presenting with Xcode too. I don't think I've ever presented Xcode code. So it compiles, and then it just does the same thing as the Android app, which is when you go into here, you can see stuff, and you click on the user detail view, and it loads it and shows it. And then in iOS, magically does this. I know how to do. So magically does the same thing. When you go in here, and you click there, and then it loads and shows the data, which is, oh, that's great. Woo! I don't know. Really sucks I couldn't show you that thing. Anyway, that's it. Any questions? I think we got like a minute or two. Nothing. Wow. All right. Cool. Yeah. Nothing. Okay.
Explained everything so well.
Yeah, that's probably what it was. Is anybody just confused and wants to express that confusion in the form of a question? Yeah, all right.
So you were talking about Kotlin.
Yeah.
Kotlin does not work with this, but I can write Kotlin code that interfaces to Java code that's compiled over. Is that what that is?
Shared code's Java. If you're calling into the shared code but it's not shared, it can be Kotlin. Or anything JVM compatible, I would guess. I've only tried Kotlin. I know. General reaction is like, oh, it's not Kotlin? I don't know. Yeah. It's not C#, that's for sure. All right. Cool. Yay. All right.
I'll give a little backstory. So the Android, or the Capital One iOS team worked really hard on a Android Summit iOS version of the app for various reasons. And we submitted 2 weeks ago, and we found out on Tuesday they rejected us for that reason. Well, you don't have it up anymore, sorry. So we may have to figure out the sad puppy stuff next year.
You just cover it up.
Well, that's my point.
I was amazed. I mean, I didn't think they would accept it. I just did it as a joke. I was like, oh, okay.
I can understand that.
Oh, yeah, I found out during the talk that they had accepted it, so it was a moment in time.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. All right. There you go.
All right. Thank you very much.